In Finnish style, we will begin right on time. Welcome. I'm Lisa Weimer, Assistant Director of Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives at the Fulbright Finland Foundation in Helsinki, and I will be moderating the webinar today. It's with great pleasure that I warmly welcome you to the first webinar in the Internationalization of Higher Education in the COVID-19 Era series. To kick off the series, we have opening remarks from two leaders in the field of international higher education. First, it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Terhi Mosa, the CEO of the Fulbright Finland Foundation. For those of you that do not know what the foundation is a Helsinki-based, private, not-for-profit organization that collaborates with a range of government, foundation, university, and corporate partners on both sides of the Atlantic to design and manage study and research scholarships, leadership development programs, and internationalization services. Terhi, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Tervetuloa. A warm welcome to everyone from Helsinki, and thank you for joining us. This session is part of a global series of 10 webinars addressing higher education internationalization in the COVID-19 era. Each webinar offers a different angle to our field, with expert panels leading the way to joint discussions. Today's inaugural webinar kicks off the series by asking the question that is in all of our minds: what's next for international education and study abroad? The magnitude of the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic has imposed on study abroad and international education are unprecedented in our lifetime. I want to begin by voicing my deep appreciation to the work of the higher education institutions, study abroad organizations, and their tireless and dedicated professionals who have dealt with the constantly evolving circumstances that keep testing their resilience and tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. This has required creativity, agility, and thinking outside the box, and doing all of that with speed. The field is confronted with a broad range of complex and fundamental questions, from health and safety to sustainability and the financial viability of programs, or even entire organizations. Difficult circumstances challenge the status quo and force us to think differently, envision new solutions, and in many cases, do what used to be unthinkable. In thinking and planning ahead, this can also be seen as an opportunity, an angle to choose to purposely focus on to help prepare the path forward, which is what is meant by the saying, never waste a crisis. We have 400 participants from 14 time zones with us today, from Sao Paulo to Sevilla to Sydney. It is illustrative that without the digital conferencing technology the pandemic forced the entire global international education community to adopt, this event too, as it is realized today, would have been unthinkable. The value of international education is paramount, and supporting the internationalization of higher education and research and study abroad is at the core of our foundation's work. We have spent a lot of effort thinking about the future, and the question that we have on the agenda of today's discussion here as well: where should we focus our efforts and take proactive steps for the future? Our vision of empowering the minds that find global solutions to tomorrow's challenges is turned into concrete tools such as our newly launched strategic flagship award, fittingly titled Seeking Solutions for Global Challenges. The thinking behind this strategy is summarized in the 3 words of our motto: together shaping the future. This same thinking has also been behind today's program, where our expert panel will lead us to think about pragmatic ways that we together can shape the future of study abroad and international higher education. And it has been behind how the webinar and the series were developed. As a strategic disposition, we do everything together. Today's event is no exception. We are very grateful to be working in tandem with the USA Study Abroad Office of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs of the U.S. Department of State and the Association of International Education Administrators. On behalf of our foundation, I want to sincerely thank them for their partnership, with a special thank you to Chief of USA Study Abroad, Heidi Manley, Amelia Vanderlaan, and Darla Deardorff from AIEA. We're also deeply grateful to USA Study Abroad for choosing us as their partner to host the global webinar series, and all of us are indebted to them for their financial sponsorship of the entire series. Thank you. I want to extend a sincere thank you to today's expert speakers. And finally, my heartfelt thank you goes to Lisa Weimer, Mirka McIntyre, Maija Kettunen, Mihkel Weim, and the entire amazing foundation team. They are the ones who make things happen and every day embody what together means in practice. Thank you. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Heidi Manley. Heidi is the CEO of USA Study Abroad at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational Cultural Affairs. She's the lead for American student mobility within the State Department, and our foundation has had the privilege to work with Heidi and her team on a number of impactful initiatives. Heidi, so pleased to have you with us. The stage is yours.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Terhi, for that kind introduction, and a warm welcome to all of you. I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all today on behalf of USA Study Abroad, part of the U.S. Department of State, to launch our inaugural global webinar series. Our team at the State Department has been working so hard on the development of this series, and I'd like to give a special shout out to my program officer, Amelia Vanderlaan, for all of her incredible efforts. And frankly, we would not have been successful in getting this series off the ground without our terrific partners at the Association of International Education Administrators and its executive director, Darla Deardorff, and the entire team at the Fulbright Finland Foundation, especially Lisa, Maija, Mirka, Mikael, and the foundation's CEO, Terhi. My USA Study Abroad team is incredibly proud and fortunate to fund and oversee the Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program and the Critical Language Scholarship, or CLS program, which collectively support almost 4,000 American, mostly undergraduate students to study, intern, or learn a language overseas. We also provide broader support to increase and diversify American student mobility through our capacity building program for US Study Abroad, which provides small grants and trainings to US colleges and universities, and our Study Abroad engagement grants, which provide small grants to our US embassies and consulates and Fulbright commissions to do the same overseas. Like many, if not most of you, we scrambled to bring home over 400 American students, in our case, Gilman scholars, from 90 countries in spring 2020, in a time of incredible uncertainty, while also developing new program policies and guidance to address a situation that seemed to evolve by the day, if not by the hour. We managed to pivot our in-person CLS language program to an entirely virtual format within 7 weeks with our overseas partners. And we somehow managed to do all of this successfully and well. And that was all due to the incredible work and dedication of our larger Gilman and CLS teams. People who are so committed to the mission of what we do and care so deeply about the people who go on our programs. We are people like you who are here for a reason. The same reason my USA Study Abroad team and the reason my entire Bureau, Educational and Cultural Affairs, exist, which is the very simple premise that people-to-people connections between the people of the United States and people around the world matters. We have been busier than ever in trying to plan for a strong return to American student mobility in the future, but to do so in a safe, responsible, ethical way for not only our American students, but for the campuses on which they will study and the communities in which they will live overseas. Part of this planning involves conversations with experts, such as the ones we are so fortunate to have with us today, and thank you all so very much for being here. But rather than having these conversations with just us, we figured we would open them to the world, as this struggle is universal, but so is the hope. Thank you all again for being with us today. We appreciate your participation very much and look forward to hearing from our assembled group of experts. Back to you, Lisa, to introduce our truly fantastic speakers. Thank you again.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you both for highlighting the essential role of international higher education in these current times. So now it's time to introduce our esteemed panel of speakers, 3 thought leaders in the field of international higher education. First, let me introduce to you Robin Matros-Helms. She was recently named the Assistant Vice President for Learning and Engagement at the American Council on Education, ACE. Within this role, she serves as the Deputy Chief Innovation Officer and Principal Internationalization Strategist. Her portfolio includes the Internationalization Laboratory and Learner Success Lab, Professional Learning Program Development, and ACE's International Research Agenda. In this role, Robin truly has her finger on the pulse with what's happening in the US international higher education environment. Next, we have Obakeng Mabokela. She is the Vice Provost for International Affairs and Global Strategy, as well as a professor of higher education at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's a Fulbrighter. She's a former Fulbrighter New Century Scholar and Fulbright International Education Administrators Program participant in France. Her research seeks to understand experiences of marginalized populations and aims to inform and influence institutional policies. Our third speaker is Cheryl Matherly, the Vice President and Vice Provost for International Affairs at Lehigh University. She is charged with providing strategic leadership for its numerous international education programs. Cheryl is the immediate past president of the AIEA. Her special area of interest includes international workforce development, and she has written extensively on the relationship between employability and education abroad. She's also a Fulbrighter. She's the recipient of 2 Fulbright grants for international education administrators in Japan and Germany. Welcome to all 3 of you. The agenda for today's webinar begins with each speaker setting the stage. So in theatrical performances, before the actors take the stage is assembled for the first act. And in this webinar, each speaker will frame the panel discussion by giving background context and information on their particular point of view from where they sit in the field of international higher education. After they set the stage, we will move into a panel discussion, which will give you some practical food for thought to help you think and plan for the future. In the end, we will wrap up the webinar with one final question to the panelists and invite you to the next webinar in this series. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded and available on our website after the event. I would also like to thank all of you attendees for submitting your questions to the panel as you registered for this webinar. Your questions were taken into consideration as we shaped the panel discussion. Since we have such a large audience and we received so many good questions in advance, there will be no Q&A this time around. We want this first webinar to address the current complex environment, but at the same time to inspire you to think about the future. So please sit back, relax, and listen, and take this opportunity to really think deeply about together shaping the future of our field. So let's get on this. Let's go set the stage. First, I would like to invite Robin to offer a bird's eye view of international higher education in the US and beyond. Robin, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you everyone for being here today for this important conversation. As Lisa said, I will start by setting the stage with a bit of a look at the national landscape for internationalization in the US, looking over the last 5 years and looking at this current moment where we find ourselves right now. Slide, please. I'll frame our conversation with some data from ACE's Mapping Internationalization on US Campuses study. This is the only comprehensive source of data and analysis on US higher education. It's a survey that we conduct every 5 years, most recently in 2016, and it includes the full range of institution types, so really a representative sample of US higher ed. Slide, please. So what was going on 5 years ago? The 2016 results. Overall, we saw optimism and commitment to internationalization. So 3/4 of institutions reported that internationalization had accelerated on their campuses in recent years. More institutions in 2016 than when we had done the survey in 2011 reported a high level of internationalization. And commensurately, if you look at the chart below, fewer institutions reported low or very low levels of internationalization. And about half of institutions had included internationalization in their mission statements and strategic plans. Slide, please. We asked institutions why they were internationalizing. The number one reason was to improve student preparedness for a global era. Number two, diversify students, faculty, and staff at the home campus. And number three, become more attractive to prospective students at home and overseas. So what we saw in these answers was really the primacy of students in global learning. And I think this is something to keep in mind as we start our forward-thinking discussion in a few moments as well. Slide, please. We also asked institutions about their priority activities for internationalization. Number one and number two were all about student mobility. So increasing study abroad for US students and recruiting international students to come to US campuses. Number three, also very much externally facing, partnerships with institutions abroad. And it was at number four and number five that we came to what was happening on the home campus. So internationalizing the curriculum and co-curriculum and faculty development. Again, maybe keeping the slide in mind as we move towards this forward-looking conversation as well. Next slide, please. So since 2016, it's been quite a 5-year period here. I'm not going to belabor this. I think a lot of people are very familiar with these issues and have been living with these issues. But we've seen a series of travel bans, visa issues, research security questions, an overall national climate and the way that we are interacting on the global stage. Long-standing issues of racial injustice really coming to the fore in the US in the last few months. Oh, and a pandemic on top of that as well. So clearly a lot going on since we did that survey and gathered our data most recently. Next slide, please. So the current state of the field, and recognizing that current maybe has even changed since I put these slides together last week, but overall tough times. Education abroad is halted, international student numbers are down. Again, referring back to that slide for our priority activities for internationalization, those have taken a big hit. We've seen budget decreases at the institutional level and for international programs specifically. And what one of my ACE colleagues has termed uncertainty fatigue. So there's less uncertainty around the outcome of the election, although there is still some uncertainty on that front in the US. But certainly there is the fatigue that comes with everything that's been happening over the last few years. We're seeing US COVID cases spiking right now. So still a lot of uncertainty going forward as well. On a positive note though, if I had to encapsulate the last 5 years for our field in one word, it would be perseverance. We've seen what I think of as scrappy creativity. As we've heard, really making these adjustments that we have to, whatever is coming into our world. So pivoting to virtual exchanges, for example, some really creative solutions for international student support, both on our campuses and for students who are abroad and not able to come to campuses. Absolutely a renewed attention to equity. Like the rest of the world, we've needed this attention for a while, and I'm seeing that really coming to the fore in conversations nationally for international education. And the commitment seems to be there. Again, there are a lot of challenges, budget challenges and other things right now. But for example, we have a full cohort of institutions that are participating in the ACE Internationalization Laboratory Program this year, which is a very concerted process around strategic planning for internationalization. This group of institutions started in August and continuing to move this work forward. And we're seeing on some campuses internationalization leaders elevated. This pandemic started as an international education issue. We were bringing students home from abroad. And so we've now seen some of the leaders on campus being part of conversations at the cabinet level and really being leaders in navigating through the entire crisis for the institutions. Next slide, please. So a few months ago, when the pandemic was sort of just getting underway, ACE developed this framework we've called the Future Positive Conceptual Framework. So going from the moment of a crisis and needing resilience to recovery, to adaptation, and eventually to innovation and to action. And I think when we put this forward in the spring, we were really in that resilience recovery mode. But in this conversation today, I think we'll really be focusing on the other end of the spectrum. So adaptation and innovation, and ultimately moving forward with action in positive directions for our field. And with that, I will turn it back over to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Appreciate it. I think it'll really be interesting to see how the next mapping research compares to the 2016 data with all of the changes over the last 4 years. So looking forward to that. Next, we have Reitu, who will give you context about the current state of international education at a large public Research One university in Illinois. Reitu?
Good afternoon, good morning to colleagues from all across the world. Thank you for joining us again. As we engage in these issues, we really believe that it is important for us to provide a little bit of context because, as you might imagine, institutional responses have been varied in terms of how they have engaged these issues around COVID specifically, but just broadly around higher education. So my perspectives and insights are informed by the fact that I sit as a senior international officer at a large research university. The university, next slide, please. The University of Illinois is one of the original 37 public land-grant universities that were created after the Morrill Act was passed in 1862, having recently celebrated our sesquicentennial in 1867. We have been in the higher education space for over 150 years. This academic year, we welcomed more than 52,000 students on our campus from 50 states. Ordinarily, we would be welcoming our international students from 100 countries. However, this year, we do welcome them. However, we've had to engage differently with the ways in which we have welcomed our students. As a major research university, we have 15 academic colleges that offer more than 150 academic programs at the undergraduate level and more than 100 postgraduate programs. One of the distinctions of being a major research university is that the University of Illinois boasts and has been home to more than 24 Nobel laureates and more than 28 Pulitzer Prize winners who are either our faculty or our alumni. And as we engage even more with technology, it is interesting to note that the first graphical web browser was created at the University of Illinois. One of the notable distinctions is that this is an institution that has a fairly impressive library with more than 24 million items, and it is the largest academic library in the US. Perhaps after, I believe we're second largest after Harvard. Next slide, please. We are home to a sizable population of international students, and in the past year, we had enrolled over 10,600 undergraduate and graduate students. The split between our undergraduates and graduates is about 4,500 undergraduates and 5,400 graduate students. So almost a very similar breakdown there with a slight preference to graduate students. In the past year, 2019, we had about 2,001 international scholars employed at the University of Illinois. Top 5 sending countries for international students are China, India, South Korea, Taiwan, and Spain. Next slide, please. As much as we welcome international students on our campus, we also send our students to study abroad. And in 2019, we had more than 2,500 students who studied abroad in 300 programs in 50 countries. And this past year, earlier this year, we were also grappling with bringing home 850 students who were studying in March in a number of countries around the world. And I'm pleased that all of them made it home safely. Our top destinations for outbound study abroad include Spain, Italy, China, Brazil, and the United Kingdom. And in terms of our academic engagement, it really does draw from a variety of colleges on our campus. Annually, we spend over $850,000 a year to support international study abroad. The next slide, please. One of the core and most important elements of our engagement is working and collaborating with our institutional partners. And this year, again, the value of our global partners cannot be overemphasized. I believe that part of our success this year in really engaging and collaborating was anchored in the relationships that we've built over time with our global partners. With more than 400 institutional partnerships that include student mobility, collaborative research, and outreach and engagement, we've really come to value and even more so realize that the success of what we do resides and lies and is anchored in how well we collaborate globally. Our top 10 partners in China, in South Korea, in Brazil, France, and I will not go through all 10 of them, but we definitely have a wide range of institutions around the world with whom we collaborate in these initiatives. Next slide, please. In terms of research, we are a major Research One university. In the past year, we have received $620 million in research and development funding. And for the last 7 years, the University of Illinois has had the distinction of being a top 10 recipient of NIH funding. And this past year in particular, and for the last 6 of the last 7 years, we have been #1 among universities in terms of receiving NSF funding. So the research operation on our campus is quite significant. We have right just on the edge of our campus a research park in which we collaborate very actively with the private sector. And currently we host more than 90 companies, including ADM, Caterpillar, Deere, among others. And these are companies that provide wonderful opportunities for our students, as well as our faculty members and scholars, to collaborate for business, for startups, and to explore entrepreneurial relationships together. So with that context, as I frame my remarks for the rest of this conversation, this is the context from which I'm emerging and anchoring a lot of my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Reitu. And we'll be really curious to hear how things have changed in 2020 as we get into the discussion. Next, let's go to Cheryl. She will highlight the current state of play of international education at a private research university in Pennsylvania. Cheryl? Cheryl, you are muted. You'll have to start over.
Let's try that again.
There we go.
So as to say, one of the things we know about US higher education is that if you're going to make generalizations, you can make generalizations about one university. It is so, every institution is so different and so distinct, so that while there are pieces here that is certainly share with what we've seen at the University of Illinois, Lehigh is a quite different institution, and I might even say, while I can speak some for what private higher ed looks like, even so it still is distinct to the context of Lehigh. But nonetheless, I think that there's some pieces here that will be instructive for the rest of our conversation. If we can go to the next slide. So as Lisa's mentioned, Lehigh is a private university, a mid-sized private university. We are located in Northeast Pennsylvania. Founded in 1865, so 2 years older than the University of Illinois, and originally founded as a school with a strong focus on science and engineering, also part of a post-Civil War reconstruction. And so where Illinois has a graphic interface, you can thank Lehigh for the escalator every time you go to a shopping mall now. It's one of our graduates on that. By size, we're quite different than Illinois. We have a little over 6,800 students, about 5,000 undergraduates and about 1,800 graduate students. We have 5 colleges. That's a College of Arts and Sciences, a College of Engineering, a College of Business, College of Education, and a brand new College of Health. We take great pride in the kind of smallness of size, and so the student faculty ratio and such, but also as an old established private university, have a healthy endowment, and we're consistently ranked among the top 50 universities in the US. So that gives you some sense of just kind of the profile. Go on to the next slide. So to give a picture of what international looks like at a place like Lehigh, I'm going to take you through some pictures here of that. So of our faculty, roughly 1/3 of our faculty have degrees from an international college or university. And so like a lot of US institutions, a very international faculty on campus. Next slide. We have about 1,400 international students coming from 93 different countries. So that majority of those are students at the graduate level, but we have a very healthy undergraduate international enrollment as well. And next slide. And this gives you a picture of how that breaks out at our institution. So roughly 32%, about 465 of our undergraduate students are international. And what's significant about that for Lehigh is that that number has remained fairly constant over the last 5 years. We've been able to maintain roughly consistent enrollment, even this year with all the volatility at undergraduate. Our graduate level, we have 525 international graduate students. That's a little different. That has been the place where we have, again, like many US institutions, seen the most volatility. And that has to do with the countries of origin of where our graduate students are coming from. Our top 4 countries of origin are China, India, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And so as we've looked at kind of fluctuations in global mobility, it's less surprising that that would be the place where we've seen some pretty significant declines over the last 5 years with international graduate students. But the other place that I'll point then is that we have 306 of our graduates who are out doing optional practical training. And that has been a huge increase for us. Again, like most US institutions, that's been one of the places that, especially with the option for students to stay to do the 3-year STEM option, it's a little bit longer to that. So let's go on to the next slide. And to give you a picture then, this is what enrollment looks like across the globe. The main thing I will point out on this slide without getting into too much detail is that like most US institutions, we are very dependent still on students coming from China, and that has also had a big impact as we've looked at the kind of mobility issues with regard to degree-seeking students coming to the institution. Next slide. But Lehigh as an institution has also made study abroad and international education experiences a significant part of the student experience, and particularly a distinctive part of our undergraduate experience. Roughly 40% of our undergraduates have some kind of an international experience by the time they graduate, and nearly half of those are students who have done that through some kind of experiential learning, an internship. And that's really become one of the centerpieces of our international education strategy. Next slide. We offer roughly 250 study abroad options in over 74 countries. But also, I'll note that on this slide, I think this is also fairly representative of how you see study abroad shaping out in the US. The red countries are places where we are running Lehigh specific programs, and the green places are places where we're working with partners specifically through third-party organizations and study abroad organizations. And that gives you some sense of how we're able as a small institution to have that kind of breadth in coverage. Next slide. One of our most distinctive programs is the Iacocca International Internship Program. This was a program established about 12 years ago with a gift from Lehigh alumnus Lee Iacocca of Chrysler fame. At the time, Iacocca was very concerned that US students were not getting enough exposure with global work, and so fully funded an international internship program that specifically targets students who've never traveled abroad or had an international experience or on a high financial need. And so this has become one of our signature experiences, and back to this focus around experiential learning. We can certainly talk about that later in this. Next slide. And last, to say we have partnerships with about 67 universities and organizations around the world. And significantly, this has become for us over the last 4 years an even more important piece of our international strategy. I'll end with one last slide, my last one here, to give an idea then just of, you've got the picture of what international looks like at Lehigh. But to pull this back to then our immediate kind of campus COVID-19 response, and certainly has informed some of our thinking on these issues, we've moved to a model of what we're calling hybrid instruction, with about 25% of our courses still happening in person, and the majority happening in some kind of remote or asynchronous learning, having a huge impact, obviously, on students who couldn't get here to campus, international or domestic students. We still do have study abroad restrictions, mostly aimed around our existing travel policies. In other words, we haven't suspended study abroad, but are following State Department and CDC alerts, and that's impacting what we're doing with when we can see reopening study abroad. We're cautiously optimistic about late spring and summer at this point. We did move to some very creative responses, I think, like a lot of institutions, of figuring out how to do remote learning for our international students who weren't able to get here to campus. And one of the things that we did was we set up what we called Lehigh in Residence with partner universities to host our first year students who weren't able to travel to the US due to travel restrictions or an inability to get visas. And then, like a lot of our colleagues, moved very quickly to experiment with virtual international internships, and our Iacocca International Internship Program went fully remote this last summer, but also looking at some alternatives for some creative virtual engagement with partners and that. So that gives some sense of what's happened here at Lehigh and how we've approached this. And so with that, I'll hand that back over to Lisa so we can start discussion.
Thanks, Cheryl. Very interesting, all the COVID-19 responses. Thanks for that. Well, thank you all for laying the groundwork and scaffolding for now our discussion. So let's go ahead and launch into it. As we all know, I mean, we're all living in a truly an exceptional moment, especially in the field of international higher education, as we help our students and international visitors navigate university restrictions, changing international travel, international border closures, restrictions, study abroad cancellations, branch camps. I mean, I could go on and on and on. But what I really want to ask here, and I'm gonna pitch this one to Robin, how do we not get lost in this current moment of crisis? Because sometimes it can feel extremely heavy. And how do we rather use this current moment as a launching pad for future development?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I think that's just been the question of the moment on a lot of our minds. So for me, I think the first thing is that we need to acknowledge that it's hard. This is a hard moment right now. There is a lot going on, and there's been a lot going on for a number of years. So taking a moment to sort of take a breath and acknowledge that it is hard, but also then notice and acknowledge that we have to keep going. Our mission in this field is too important to not do that. So we have to persevere. We understand certainly in this audience the importance of our work, but I think as we look forward, particularly in light of budget cuts and some really tough decisions that institutions are making about priorities, making the case for why this work is important may become increasingly important on our campuses. So articulating the connection, for example, between international engagement and the work we're doing and the overall mission and strategy of the institution may become increasingly important. So not just internationalization for the sake of being international, but internationalization as furthering overall institutional priorities, like student success, for example, really tuning into the individual missions of the institutions and making that connection. Also recognizing that the national policy context in the US is likely to be changing. And so the ways of making the case for the broader community and for the nation as a whole the narrative may be shifting around that. And so tuning into sort of the overall tone that we're hearing and connecting internationalization again to these broader priorities. And then finally, I would just say, pick something to do. We want to be thinking forward. We want to be thinking big. We're going to do that in this conversation, but also just making some concrete progress, things that we can be proud of, and celebrating those steps that we're taking in this environment. And we'll talk about some of those very concrete ideas in this conversation as well.
Okay, great. And so, Robin, you talked about, kind of connecting the international engagement to the university mission. And I want to lob this question to Reitu. Considering the three missions, research, teaching, outreach, and engagement of most universities, where should we focus our efforts and take proactive steps for the future of international education? Reitu?
As we consider the tripartite mission of many universities, as you correctly noted, the research, the teaching, the outreach, and the engagement, and sitting at a land-grant research university, one of the things that the University of Illinois, just as an example, takes very seriously is the social responsibility that this institution has, not only to the community within which it resides, but within the broader state, within the country, nationally and internationally. And so as we've navigated not only the current time, but as we think about the future, one of the areas, for example, that we take to heart is the way in which we can use our research to inform, to be innovative, and to identify solution-driven initiatives and projects. Just as an example, during this COVID period, the University of Illinois developed a saliva test that was used on our campus to help us monitor COVID cases among our students and our entire staff and university. We all have to test. At the beginning of the semester, everybody had to test twice a week, and now faculty and staff have transitioned into testing once a week, and students still have to test at least twice a week. So this, of course, has helped the university itself respond to COVID. But more broadly is the contribution that this saliva test has then had to the broader state. And we're now under significant conversation with the health officials within the state to think about and convey how this test could then be used to address a very critical issue that all of us are dealing with. So for us here at the University of Illinois, really being intentional about engaging and utilizing the research that we do at our university to support and enhance the broader contributions to beyond the university. But I think because, again, students are very central to what we do at the university, one of our core priorities is to ensure that we enhance the curriculum even during this time. So while, for example, we do have a hybrid model very similar to what Lehigh has this semester, we have a substantial number of our students who are not able to travel to the US, especially our international students. So we've had to be very intentional to ensure that not only do we utilize our curriculum to make sure that our students' academic progress is not disrupted, but we've also had to think very intentionally about how we work with our faculty members to utilize technology, to support faculty members as they transition very rapidly in the spring semester, but even now in the fall semester where we had a little bit more time to be planful. But when we think about where we then integrate, what this opportunity and this particular moment has afforded us the opportunity to do is to actually integrate the international and the global in ways that perhaps even just at the beginning of the year, we would not have thought about integrating. While we were forced and thrust into utilizing Zoom and other platforms, what this has afforded us the opportunity to do is to engage those students, to engage those faculty members who might ordinarily not integrate the international and the global into the curriculum. So I see this really as a fundamental opportunity where we could provide opportunities for students, especially who might otherwise not get on a plane and travel far away to engage in a study abroad experience, to be exposed to global insights and perspectives and to interact in that space in ways that they otherwise might not have had the opportunity to do.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point about the science. Science has no borders, right? We are certainly learning that with this current predicament that we are in. You know, I want to get down to some pragmatic ways that we can shape the future. So Cheryl, I'm going to pass this one off to you. What are, and then what I'd like to do is kind of open it for a discussion among all of the panelists. So what are some pragmatic ways that we together can shape the future of international higher education? Like, what are the maybe top 3 ways? What do you think, Cheryl?
So I'd say the first thing is to really recognize the opportunities in this moment. And by that, I mean, so the reality is, and I think it's just the fact that we're all sitting here on a Zoom call like this is illustrative of this. No one's traveling, and so we're all working together by Zoom and this, and in a strange way, I think that's actually increasing connectivity as we get through this. And I can give just a few examples of things from my own campus. You know, we have a long-standing partnership with the UN, and the number of senior officials at the UN that we have been able to engage with our students and with our faculty this fall has been on a completely different scale than we had at any other point in time. We have a number of new partnerships that have taken off, and in some ways, I think these partnerships have been accelerated because we've been able to get faculty to talk and interact in a way that ordinarily had been pretty difficult to do. But again, because people are there and we have this access to Zoom connectivity, we're having some dialogue and some new partnerships are accelerating. I might even add, and in a peculiar way, we're even seeing partnerships work better because there's a kind of personal quality. I have met more of my colleagues' kids and pets and seen the insides of their kitchens, you know, from this, in a way that is sort of moving these kind of relationships along in a way that had been much slower at other points in time. And I could go on with other examples of where I'm seeing that kind of creativity that's coming about because we're seizing this moment of what we are all dealing with and what we're leaning into. And I'm actually optimistic that at the end of this, I think we're going to be emerging with a more robust set of partnerships than we went into this with. Which gets to my second sort of practical tip, which is engage with partners. I think what we're going to see as we come out of this pandemic, that the focus of international education is really going to is shifting towards partnerships and away from other programmatic areas. And I think that was already hinted at in the data that Robin shared. And I think that this really is, we're seeing that happen in a really significant way. Partly because we're seeing things where we've had to be dependent on partners in ways we didn't really anticipate that we first needed to be. So for example, you know, Reitumetse discusses Lehigh, same situation. Our students who couldn't get here to study on campus this fall suddenly dependent on a whole new new relationship with partners to help us out as we're dealing with the needs of these students. We're seeing some really creative ways that faculty research engagements are continuing because they're able to be dependent upon partners in other parts of the world to continue work on their behalf when they're not able to do travel on that. Again, I can go on with other examples of it, but what we're seeing is that I think these partnerships becoming a really critical tool to help us sort of extend our reach and connection and mission, if you will, during this particular time. So a second, I say, is really engage partners and strengthen that. And then the third practical tip I would give is to really use this as an opportunity to gain buy-in for different models of programming, global programming, and specifically things like COIL learning or virtual exchanges. You know, prior to the pandemic, there was already some growing concern about the study abroad in particular as being not very sustainable, the risk of it being an elitist activity because still less than 2% of students in the US participated. And so those were already out there, and we were already talking about the importance, say, of virtual exchanges as a way to really spread global learning. But I can tell you, a year ago, when that came up on our campus, absolutely no support for it on the part of students or faculty. And the reason was that people were saying, there's no way, this just can't replace the quality of this kind of interaction. Well, amazing, in response to COVID, like everyone, suddenly, when you don't have options, you move quickly, and we did very quickly stand up a lot of international internship and experiential learning programs. And the surprise was they worked pretty well. And now we're looking as we go forward at not only more robust offering in that space. Our College of Arts and Sciences has added a virtual international internship course for the spring semester as a way to ensure that global learning was still part of what their curriculum was, and a new way to engage students. And so we're seeing a kind of acceptance there. And as one of my colleagues said to me after we got into all of this, that one of the outcomes of the pandemic is that we can no longer say that this kind of learning can't happen virtually, because we've all had to figure out how to do this. And so I'd say sort of lean into that and use this as an opportunity to gain some both experience, but also acceptance for some of these other kind of models that I think are going to be really important as we continue to think some of the longer goals about access and opportunity in international learning.
Great, some really good points. Robin or Reitu, do you have anything to add? What are some pragmatic ways that we can shape?
I think building exactly on what Cheryl and Reitu talked about with the curriculum piece, one thing I would add to that on-campus learning is to engage with student affairs professionals on campus and be thinking about ways to bring global learning into the co-curriculum as well as into our classrooms to build that really well-rounded experience. And I do think, to Cheryl's point, this is equity, very much so. That was one of the questions that came up from people as they registered for this event today. I think we collectively can genuinely commit to global learning for all students. And in all the ways that both Reitu and Cheryl talked about, bringing that about, recognizing these different formats of global learning. And a really kind of pragmatic suggestion to pull all of that together is to consider the idea of a certificate or a credential for graduation that recognizes these multiple paths to global learning, but really makes it clear that students have put an effort into global competence and are coming out of their degree, again, having gained these skills and this mindset from an array of different venues throughout their experience, but something that really marks them as having put that time in. So that's something, again, in this moment, very pragmatic that potentially can be developed. The other very pragmatic piece, also building on what Reitu and Cheryl suggested, was recognizing all these different modes of global learning as we return to education abroad, really understanding in more detail as a field and on our campuses what does have to be done in person. What can we not replicate in a virtual environment? Because then we can focus on that and use the virtual to scaffold that and to complement that. So very pragmatically, I think that means program evaluation. And that means really reflecting on the experiences that we're having, what students are learning and what they're not learning from those. I think this program evaluation needs to be consistent. It needs to be in depth, but not necessarily complicated. It doesn't have to be, sort of the massive impact study at this point. It really is checking in with students, taking stock of things, talking with faculty to understand student experiences in this moment and to help us plan going forward.
Rachel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the point I'd like to offer here is that we have an opportunity to bridge the digital divide. What this pandemic has offered us an opportunity to do is to engage with partners in parts of the world where, if we're not traveling on a plane, sometimes we would have been limited in terms of our interaction with them. So, for example, if we're looking at engaging on the African continent, this is a part of the world where we know there's a significant demand. And there's, if one is looking at projections for growth, there's going to be significant demand for higher education. But if I'm sitting here in North America, many of our institutions have modest, at best, engagement on the African continent. But really, what the pandemic has offered us an opportunity to do is engage these partners who have much to contribute to this discourse, to our world in higher education. And over the last 6 months, I've probably interacted more with counterparts and with colleagues on the African continent, in Latin America, again, another region of the world where we know all the population projections indicate that we are going to have significant demand and significant growth in the college age population. So in many ways, the pandemic has been an equal opportunity pandemic in that regard, and leveled and opened up some areas where perhaps we would have been limited by just our ability to get on a plane and go other places. Just as an example, this summer, one of the things that we typically do at the University of Illinois is offer an orientation, an in-person orientation, where we would put a team of 10 to 12 colleagues on a plane and travel to few parts of the world. Typically, we would go to China, we would go to South Korea, and this year we were planning to go to India before the pandemic. What this year allowed us to do was to take that orientation, create a virtual set of orientations, multiple, where we then were able to engage with students in parts of the world where we typically do not get on a plane and go, just by virtue of the limited resources that we have. So this year we were able to engage students in Africa. We're engaged students in Europe. We're able to engage students, of course, in China, South Korea, and other parts of Asia. We're able to engage students in the Middle East. So this has opened up that forum and that opportunity to be much more directly involved with parts of our higher education community that we historically have not been engaged with.
Thank you. I mean, I think, what all three of you are talking about is that it's kind of like the silver lining of the pandemic, in a sense that, I mean, of course, there's many challenges, but, also within the challenges, there are opportunities for us to really just think outside of the box when it comes to international higher education. What can we do from an equity perspective to open up access to global learning on campus and virtually? So these are some really practical ideas. Thank you for sharing those. I want to kind of come back to student mobility, because this is something that was so essential to international higher education prior to this moment in time. And there was a question from one of the participants that what will be the new value proposition for student mobility post COVID-19? Do any of you have thoughts on this? Silence. Not so sure. Does anyone want to take a stab at this?
I'll maybe get us started, and then my colleagues can
Okay.
as well. I think that there will still be some need and a place for student mobility to occur. What this pandemic has afforded us the opportunity to do is think creatively about how we think about student mobility. So just as an example, so if you were looking at collaborative academic programs where perhaps students might begin a portion of their academic program in their home institution, come and spend a semester, a year at our home institution, at another institution, a host institution, and then return home to complete their work. So I think now what this time has afforded us the opportunity to do is to think very creatively about what these combinations of mobility will look like. I think now we've experimented, we've allowed ourselves to make a few mistakes and created spaces where that mobility or how we utilize the opportunity when we get together can be significantly enhanced by the work and the preparation that we do prior to our gathering and prior to seeing each other. So if I'm looking at a research project, it's just as an example, students, undergraduate, graduate students could begin working together while working with a faculty member on a research project, get a lot of the foundational work done so that when they eventually come together in either direction, because mobility goes is bidirectional. So when students come together eventually, they have refined and they're absolutely utilizing the valuable resource that is time, or an opportunity to work in a lab, or an opportunity to work in the field in a very intentional, very concrete way. So there is a place for mobility, but it's the how and how we enhance the time that we have together, and we maximize and optimize that engagement, that the face-to-face engagement that will in many ways be complementary, I think, now to the virtual preparation that we do, just as an example.
Yeah.
So I think I would pick up on a couple of pieces here to this. I think just broadly, I don't think that we're going to see any significant decline in interest in things international on the part of students. And I think if anything, the pandemic has really made that need to understand global interconnectedness even more real and more immediate on that. And so, we're seeing just anecdotally, we're not seeing any decline in the number of students who say that they're planning to do study abroad at some point when we're able to, or applying to international program, or applying to our Fulbrights. We're not seeing that decline. That there's a kind of a patience recognizing it's not going to happen for a while, but the interest still is there. And I think that's significant. But I do think what's different, and I think this is where we're what I think may look different, and this is sort of my guess on the other, as we begin to think on the other side of this. I think there is also we're seeing that there is an expectation again that there be a purpose and an intention to doing these kind of programs and experiences. And I think I'm seeing what I'm not seeing, at least kind of anecdotally, I'm not hearing students talk about wanting to have the great big study tours come back. I hear them instead talking about, I'm really excited to be involved in this research project that would have me involved with a child and maternal health project in Sierra Leone. That they're programs that are things that are where it's about that impact and being, and the travel and mobility is really intentionally connected to the purpose of the activity. I think to some of the issues there that Robin talked about. I think the last then, and this I think really gets to this question of value proposition, I think recognizing that that students and family in U.S. higher education were already increasingly price sensitive for good reasons, and I think we're really going to see that coming out of COVID. And as we think about sort of broadening access to programs to more diverse groups of students, we really need to pay attention to what things intentionally or unintentionally create obstacles. And part of that comes back being really clear on how does an experience, a travel experience, a study abroad experience, really add value to the university degree, the university experience. And I think that's something that institutions have to be really, really clear on that. And I think we're beyond the point of just nice language of understanding other places and cultures. It has to be very specific. This is what you learn. This is why you need to do this in this particular place. Here's how it helps you with getting a job. Here's how it makes you more employable. Here's how it affects your graduate school application. All of those things there, I think, become really important. And I think, you know, we were going that way. But I really do think that price sensitivity that we're going to see, for which was here and will definitely continue going forward, is going to be really important, because I don't think there's going to be the place for something where there's a cost associated, where there's not perceived as a real kind of return on investment. And that's a very different way. I mean, higher ed, we don't like to think in terms of those kind of a piece, but I think that for students and families, I think that's going to also be part of it.
Very, very good. You know, unfortunately, our time is ending, and I have one final question that is the crux of this discussion. So I want to launch into that. Robin, sorry if you had something to say there, but maybe you can put it into your answer for this one. So if you could briefly answer this, of course, in a minute or two, that would be great. What is the future of international education? Where do you see international education in 5 years from today, post-COVID? What do you think? What is it going to look like?
Well, I think as practitioners, I think we're going to surprise ourselves with everything that we can do. We're going to look back at this when whatever it is has passed and we have a moment to take a breath. I think we're going to look back and say, wow, we accomplished a lot. We were pushed to be creative and we had really impressive results. And we've broadened our skill sets and our view of what is possible. And we're not going to go back from that. We're going to, I think, as Cheryl talked about, we're understanding these multiple paths to global competence. So I think as a field, we're getting more nimble and we're getting more flexible, and we're going to feel more confident about responding to whatever is coming next. I think we're also shoring up our systems and our policies right now, so that if something comes down the pike, we have our risk management systems in place. So I think we're going to be safer as a field also. And then I'm just going to put in one shameless plug that Lisa did for me a little bit earlier. We'd love for you to help us keep track of this. We're launching our Mapping Internationalization on U.S. Campuses survey for 2021 next January or February. And so for those of you in the US, please fill it out. We'll have some COVID specific questions, some forward-looking questions as well. So I think that's part of ACE's commitment, is to monitor all of this and keep the field informed about these developments going forward.
Great. And Cheryl and Reitu, any final thoughts on this? Where will we be in 5 years?
So I think there's going to be the three big issues that were out there prior to COVID that we're still going to have to address when we come out of this. I think a lot of decisions are going to be around how to make study abroad and international education opportunities, find a good financial model that is sustainable for the long haul. I think we're going to be looking at how to reconcile the making study abroad as a sustainable activity. And I think addressing these issues of access to really confront that it's not something that is for such a small group. And so the things that I would say, my quick hit list of things that I think we can expect coming out of this in the future, I think that remote and virtual learning will continue not as a replacement, but to augment what we're doing in terms of in-person travel, so that when we get to the point of doing and being able to return to travel, that activity is really intentional to the question, I think it was what Robin had said before, so that when we do it, there's a real clear reason as to why we're doing that, and using virtual as a way to help other places, to help expand access to that. I think when it resumes, we're going to see shorter programs initially, and then merging into longer programs, just so that we can basically get people comfortable again with traveling and comfortable with our infrastructure there to do that. And I also think that we're going to see that internships and experiential learning programs which were already gaining momentum prior to this, will be some of the early areas where we will see a lot of growth. Because back to that clear, what is perceived as value proposition, I think those will be some of the easiest areas early on for students and families to see. So I would put money that those would be places where we will most early see some of the study abroad opportunities return.
Reitu, any final thoughts on this?
Yes, I think what this moment in our higher education history has highlighted are the deep-seated issues around equity, access, and social injustice. And as institutions of higher education, one of our responsibilities, and as we look to the future, is that we have a fundamental responsibility to address some of these issues, both in our own institutions, nationally and internationally. So I would hope that as we think about what the future holds, and as we prepare for what that future looks like, we are being very intentional in creating institutional structures, institutional cultures, institutional practices that fundamentally address these issues. I think as we look to the next 5 years, we are going to see competition, even much more robust competition globally in the higher education space. What COVID has afforded the opportunities for all of us to play, for all of us to be innovative, for all of us to experiment. And particularly, I think at the undergraduate level, we are going to see in a more robust way other centers of excellence emerge globally, which is a wonderful thing for our students. But I think we can fully anticipate that there will be other key players, perhaps that might be emerging at this point, but will become significantly more robust as we look ahead to the future. And I think what the pandemic has highlighted for us is that we are permanently globally connected as a society, economically, be it socially, be it environmentally, be it educationally. And I believe that we have a collective responsibility to train and prepare globally competent and globally conscious students. So that's how I would end my remarks for this morning, or this afternoon or evening, depending on where people are listening from in this world.
And Reitu, I think that's a really good note to end on, is that, you know, the pandemic has really demonstrated that one thing, that we are globally connected. So I think with that, you know, we can take this as a moment to pause, reflect, but then also to really think creatively in the future. Some of the takeaways that I think as I was listening to you all, there were so many good little nuggets of stuff that I was writing down here, but I want to highlight a few of the takeaways. Cheryl, you had talked about the importance of partnerships, how incredibly essential those partnerships have become in this moment, and you know, the authenticity of them, but also the dependency of them. And so going forward, it'll be interesting to see how those continue to develop now that we are really connected with our partners, more so than probably previously. So I think that's one area to watch. And then going back to something that Robin had said, you know, that really in this moment, it's a time to make the case for international education. So, you know, making sure to connect international engagement with the university strategy and mission. I think that's a really important takeaway. And then Reitu, what you said, bridging the digital divide, looking at social justice, equity as we go forward, really taking a moment to say, okay, how can we all play this game? So I just, yeah, thank you all. This was a really great conversation. I wish that we had, you know, a few more hours that we could spend on this. So thank you for your perspectives and also your inspirational thoughts. I hope that the audience members also are leaving with some good takeaways. Before we sign off, we'd like to invite our audience members to the next webinars in our series. So here you can see the next 3 webinars. And at this moment, registration is open for all 3. So if you would like to join us, we welcome you. We will also send you a follow-up email that includes the recording of this webinar and an invitation to the next webinars. Also, as you push the leave button, you will automatically get this survey that pops up on your screen. So if you can take a moment to give us some feedback, we would really appreciate it as we go forward. This is our first one, so we are learning as we go. And finally, on behalf of the Fulbright Finland Foundation, as well as the collaborating team at the Department of State's USA Study Abroad branch and AIEA, we thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.